Hold on. Did you just hear about checks showing up before Christmas? You're not alone. Social media is absolutely exploding right now with news about President Trump's dividend checks, and millions of Americans are asking the same question. Am I getting money? Here's the truth that everyone needs to know right now. President Trump just announced something called the Warrior Dividend, 1,776 checks going to approximately 1.5 million U.S. military service members before Christmas. Yes, you heard that right. The checks are already on their way, and the number isn't random. It honors the year 1776 when America was founded. But here's where it gets interesting. Trump has also been talking about a much bigger dividend plan, potential $2,000 payments for everyday Americans from tariff revenue. He's floated this idea multiple times, saying everyone except high-income earners could receive these checks. The White House even confirmed they're committed to this concept. So what's really happening? Who's actually getting money? Is this just for military families, or will you see a payment too? Are these tariff dividend checks really coming, or is it just talk? And most importantly, what do you need to do to make sure you don't miss out? We're breaking down everything. The Warrior Dividend that's already being distributed, the proposed tariff dividends that could put thousands in your pocket, the timeline for when payments might arrive, and exactly who qualifies. This isn't just another rumor. This is happening now, and you need the facts. If you want the complete truth about Trump's dividend checks, smash that like button right now, and let's dive into exactly what we know. All right, let's start with what's actually happening right now, because this is real money going out to real people before Christmas. On Wednesday night, December 17th, President Trump stood in the White House diplomatic reception room and made an announcement that immediately sent shockwaves through military communities across America. He said that over 1.45 million military service members would be receiving a special bonus of exactly $1,776 before Christmas Day. Trump emphasized that these checks were already on their way, meaning this isn't some future promise or political talking point. This is happening as we speak. Now, you might be wondering why that specific number, and honestly, it's pretty clever symbolism. The 1776 figure directly honors the year of America's founding, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth explained that this payment commemorates not just today's military but the 250 years of service members who've defended this nation. The timing couldn't be more strategic either, arriving just before the holidays when military families could really use that extra financial cushion. Trump specifically said during his address that nobody deserves this more than the military, and he congratulated every service member who would be receiving it. But here's where things get really interesting from a practical standpoint. This Warrior Dividend isn't just some random bonus that appeared out of nowhere. According to Pentagon officials and a senior administration official who spoke about the details, these payments are actually coming from something called the One Big Beautiful Bill that Congress passed earlier this year. That legislation appropriated $2.9 billion to the Pentagon, specifically to supplement something called the Basic Allowance for Housing, or BAH for short. Defense Secretary Hegseth directed his department to disburse $2.6 billion total as part of this Warrior Dividend program, with the remaining $300 million being set aside for future housing allowance requirements. What makes this payment particularly attractive for service members is that it's completely tax-free. That's right, the full $1,776 goes directly into their pockets without any federal income tax being taken out. The money appears as a non-taxable supplement to their regular monthly housing allowance on their leave and earnings statement. For military families who are dealing with high costs of living near installations, expensive holiday shopping, or just trying to build up their savings, this is real money that makes a real difference. And the best part is that service members don't have to do anything to receive it. There's no application process, no forms to fill out, no jumping through bureaucratic hoops. If you're eligible, the money automatically shows up. Speaking of eligibility, let's talk about exactly who qualifies for these warrior dividend checks because this is crucial information. Active duty service members in pay grades of 06 and below as of November 30th qualify automatically. That covers the vast majority of the military, from junior enlisted personnel all the way up through most officers, excluding only the very highest ranks. But it's not just active duty troops who benefit. Reserve component members, including National Guard and Reserve personnel, also qualify if they were on active duty orders of 31 days or more as of November 30th. This means approximately 1.28 million active duty members and 174,000 reserve component members are getting these payments. The timeline for actually receiving the money is pretty straightforward. Pentagon officials have confirmed that service members can expect to see the $1,776 payment before December 20th. That gives military families just enough time to use this money for Christmas expenses, year-end bills, or whatever financial needs they have. The payment doesn't affect any other military benefits either. Your regular pay stays the same, your housing allowance continues as normal, your retirement calculations aren't impacted, and this doesn't count against you for any other programs or benefits. It's truly a standalone, one-time payment that sits completely separate from your regular compensation package. Now, President Trump made a big point during his announcement about how this warrior dividend was funded. He claimed that tariffs brought in way more money than anybody expected, and that this extra revenue made the payments possible. He specifically said during his speech that the administration made a lot more money than anybody thought because of tariffs, and the bill helped them along. This is where things start to get a bit complicated and where we need to separate political messaging from financial reality. While Trump credits tariffs for funding these checks, the actual source of the money is that congressional appropriation we talked about earlier. The government did collect significant tariff revenue this year, but budget experts point out that these military payments required explicit congressional authorization, which they received through the One Big Beautiful Bill legislation. Let's put some real numbers on the table about tariff revenue because this becomes super important when we start talking about the bigger dividend proposal. Through the end of October, the federal government collected about $309 billion in tariff revenue, compared to $165 billion through the same point last year. That's an increase of roughly $144 billion. The current overall average tariff rate is 18%, which is actually the highest it's been since 1934. So yes, tariffs are bringing in substantially more money than they used to. But the question becomes whether there's enough revenue to fund the much larger dividend program that Trump has been promising for all Americans. And that brings us to the proposal that's got everyone talking, the one that could potentially affect millions of everyday Americans beyond just military families. Starting back in November, Trump began floating the idea of sending $2,000 tariff dividend checks to most Americans. He first mentioned it in a Truth Social post, where he said that a dividend of at least $2,000 per person, not including high-income people, would be paid to everyone. The announcement came during a time when Americans were expressing serious concerns about inflation, the cost of groceries, housing expenses, and overall affordability. Trump positioned these dividend checks as a way to share the wealth generated by his tariff policies directly with the American people. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, confirmed just days later that President Trump remains committed to sending each American a $2,000 dividend check distributed from tariff revenue. She told reporters at the White House that the president made it clear he wants to make it happen, and his team of economic advisors are actively looking into how to execute the plan. This wasn't just a throwaway comment or a trial balloon. The administration is apparently seriously exploring different ways to actually implement this program. However, and this is a big however, there are significant questions about the feasibility, the timeline, and who would actually qualify. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent added another layer of complexity to the conversation when he appeared on television, and seemed to suggest that the $2,000 might not come in the form of direct checks at all. He said the dividend could come in lots of forms and lots of ways, and might instead refer to tax savings that Americans would see from Trump's tax legislation. That would include things like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security benefits, and deductibility on auto loans. These are substantial deductions that were included in the tax bill, and Besant implied that the cumulative value of these tax breaks might be what Trump means when he talks about a $2,000 dividend. This created some confusion because Trump's original post made it sound like Americans would actually receive checks similar to the stimulus payments that went out during the pandemic. But Besant's comments suggested it might be more of an indirect benefit through reduced taxes rather than direct payments. The White House later clarified that they're still exploring options and that nothing has been finalized yet. Trump himself provided a bit more detail during comments at the White House, saying that dividends would be issued probably in the middle of next year, and that thousands of dollars would go to moderate income and middle-income Americans. Let's talk about who would potentially qualify for these tariff dividend checks if they do happen. Trump has consistently said that high-income people would be excluded, but he hasn't provided a specific income threshold. Looking back at the pandemic-era stimulus checks that Trump authorized during his first term gives us some clues about what the structure might look like. Those stimulus payments were made available to individuals making up to $75,000 per year and couples making up to $150,000. Beyond those benchmarks, higher earners were eligible for smaller, phased-out payments. Treasury Secretary Besant mentioned in interviews that the rebates would likely go to families making less than $100,000, though he emphasized that this threshold is still being discussed. If we run the numbers using that $100,000 income threshold, policy experts estimate that about 150 million American adults would qualify. At $2,000 per person, that would cost approximately $300 billion. Now here's where the math starts to get really tight. As of September 30th, the federal government had generated about $195 billion in tariff-related revenue. That's significantly less than the $300 billion that would be needed for dividend checks. Some analysts who factor in only the revenue generated specifically by Trump's new tariffs and account for some negative budgetary impacts from those policies estimate net tariff revenues of only $90 billion. That falls even shorter of what would be required. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget ran their own analysis and came up with an even higher price tag. They projected that Trump's dividend proposal could cost up to $600 billion depending on how it's structured, particularly if children are included in the payments like they were during the pandemic stimulus rounds. To put that in perspective, using only tariff revenue to fund $600 billion in payments would take approximately 2 years based on current collection rates. That's assuming tariff rates stay the same and revenue doesn't decline, which is far from guaranteed. There's another major complication that could dramatically impact the availability of tariff funds for dividend payments. The Supreme Court recently heard arguments about whether President Trump exceeded his authority when he imposed sweeping tariffs by invoking national emergency powers. About $100 billion of the total tariff revenue collected so far came through this emergency authority mechanism. If the Supreme Court rules that Trump didn't have the legal authority to impose those tariffs, the administration may be required to refund that money to the businesses who paid it. That would significantly reduce the pool of available tariff money and could completely upend any dividend payment plans. Budget experts also note that if the court rules against the administration, and they've already distributed money to individuals as dividends, it creates a messy situation of having to somehow claw back funds that people have already spent. Beyond just the math and the legal questions, there's the fundamental issue of congressional approval. Past stimulus checks required Congress to pass legislation authorizing the Treasury Department to send out payments. The 3 rounds of stimulus during the pandemic were all signed into law, 2 by Trump and 1 by President Biden, but they all went through the congressional process first. The Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse, meaning the executive branch can't just decide to send out money without legislative authorization. Senator Josh Hawley, a Republican from Missouri, introduced legislation back in the summer that would have given $600 tariff rebate checks to nearly all Americans and their dependent children, but that bill never advanced. It's unclear whether Trump has enough support in Congress to pass a $2,000 dividend program, even among Republicans. Economists have also raised concerns about the inflationary impact of sending out large stimulus-style payments. When the pandemic checks went out, they provided crucial relief to struggling families, but economists estimate they also contributed somewhere between 1 and 3 percentage points to inflation. If the government were to send out $2,000 checks now, at a time when the economy is relatively stable but inflation remains a concern, it could push prices higher rather than providing real relief. Some economists argue that it would be another factor adding to inflation rather than bringing it down. The money people receive might help in the short term, but if it causes prices to rise across the board, the benefit gets eaten up pretty quickly. There's also the question of what sending out dividend checks would do to the federal budget deficit. The Tax Foundation analyzed the proposal and concluded that under nearly any design option, sending out $2,000 payments to Americans would increase, not decrease, the federal budget deficit. They pointed out that even if you set aside the tariff revenue that's already been collected, you have to account for the fact that tariffs actually reduce other forms of tax revenue. For every dollar of tariff revenue, about 24 cents is offset in lost income and payroll tax revenue because tariffs slow economic activity. When you adjust for that economic feedback effect, the net revenue from tariffs is substantially lower than the headline numbers suggest. Trump has tried to address these concerns by saying that money left over after the dividend payments would be used to pay down the national debt. He's repeatedly emphasized that the United States has an enormous debt of $37 trillion, and that tariff revenue represents a way to start chipping away at that massive obligation. The challenge is that you can't simultaneously use tariff money to fund dividend checks, pay for tax cuts, reduce the deficit, support military housing, fund child care programs, and cover all the other things Trump has suggested tariffs could pay for. At some point, the math simply doesn't work because you're promising to spend the same dollar multiple times. Speaking of all those different promises, it's worth noting that the warrior dividend for military members is actually at least the 10th different thing Trump has proposed paying for with tariff revenue. Over the course of his campaign and his time back in office, he's suggested that tariffs could fund eliminating income taxes entirely, paying for enhanced child care, covering the cost of Republican tax cuts, providing farm bailouts, sending universal dividend checks, reducing the national debt, balancing the federal budget, and now the warrior dividend for troops. Each of these proposals has merit on its own, but collectively they represent spending commitments that far exceed the available tariff revenue, even under the most optimistic projections. So, where does all of this leave regular Americans who are wondering if they're going to see a check? The honest answer is that it's genuinely uncertain. The warrior dividend for military members is real, it's funded, it's been authorized by Congress, and the checks are literally in the process of being distributed right now. That's happening. The broader $2,000 dividend for all Americans remains a proposal that the administration is committed to pursuing, but significant hurdles remain. It would require congressional authorization, which isn't guaranteed. It would need a sustainable funding source, which may not exist at current tariff levels. It would have to survive potential legal challenges, particularly if the Supreme Court rules against Trump's tariff authority, and it would need to be structured in a way that doesn't create unintended economic consequences like higher inflation or increased deficits. The most likely scenario, based on what we're hearing from administration officials and congressional sources, is that any civilian dividend program would come sometime in mid to late 2026, if it happens at all. Trump specifically mentioned the middle of next year as a target timeframe. That would give the administration time to work with Congress on legislation, to see how the Supreme Court rules on tariff authority, to assess the actual revenue coming in from tariffs over a full year, and to structure the program in a way that addresses some of the economic concerns. It's also possible that instead of direct checks, the administration pursues the approach that Secretary Bessent hinted at, where the benefit comes through tax reductions rather than actual payments. For everyday Americans trying to plan their finances, the prudent approach is to not count on receiving a tariff dividend check anytime soon. If it happens, it'll be a pleasant surprise and a welcome boost to your finances. But building your budget around money that isn't guaranteed would be risky. The Warrior Dividend demonstrates that Trump is willing to follow through on these kinds of promises when he has the authority and funding to do so, which is encouraging. But the scale of a universal dividend program is so much larger and involves so many more complications that it's impossible to say with certainty whether it'll actually materialize. What we can say is that this conversation about tariff dividends reflects a larger debate happening in American politics right now about who benefits from trade policy and how government revenue should be used. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods, and like any tax, they generate revenue that flows into the Treasury. The question becomes whether that money should go toward deficit reduction, toward tax cuts, toward specific programs like military housing, or directly back to citizens in the form of dividend payments. Different people have different views on what's the most beneficial use of those funds, and that debate will continue to play out over the coming months. If you're a military service member or a family member of someone in the military, the key thing to know is that the Warrior Dividend is real and it's coming. You don't need to do anything to receive it. The payment will automatically appear on your leave and earnings statement as a tax-free supplement before December 20th. Make sure you're checking your military pay statement so you know when it hits. And remember, this doesn't affect any of your other benefits or pay, so it's purely additional money coming your way. For everyone else, the best advice is to stay informed, watch for official announcements from the White House and Treasury Department, and be skeptical of anyone claiming to have inside information about when checks are going out or how much you'll receive. If and when a civilian dividend program moves forward, it will be announced through official channels, legislation will be passed, and there will be clear guidance about eligibility, amounts, and timelines. Until then, any specific claims about dates or procedures should be treated with healthy skepticism. This is a developing story, and we'll continue to monitor it as more information becomes available. The bottom line is that some Americans, specifically military service members, are definitely getting dividend checks before Christmas. Whether that expands to a broader program for all Americans remains to be seen, but it's something the administration says they're committed to pursuing in the year ahead.